Nate Carver sat in a sleek, dimly lit bar in the heart of Nob Hill, San Francisco, surrounded by his usual crowd, high-powered tech entrepreneurs, investors, and influencers. The conversation was flowing just as smoothly as the champagne, but Nate wasn't paying much attention to the chatter. He was busy tapping at his phone, checking the latest numbers for his startup, making sure his empire was still growing at the expected pace. In his world, that was all that mattered. Wealth, success, power. "Hey, Nate," a voice interrupted his thoughts. It was Chris, his best friend and co-founder. He leaned in, grinning mischievously. "How about a little challenge?" Nate raised an eyebrow, his lips curling into a smile. He'd been asked to do many things, but Chris always had a way of coming up with bets that could only be described as absurd. "What's the catch this time?" Nate asked, glancing up from his phone. "You," Chris said with a laugh. "Prove you can be a good guy. Bet you can't befriend a homeless person." Nate laughed, shaking his head. "Are you serious?" "I'm dead serious. If you're as good at connecting with people as you claim, you should have no problem." Chris leaned back in his chair, taking a sip of his drink. "You know, show everyone that you're not just about the money, that you've got heart." The group of friends surrounding them snickered, waiting for Nate to react. It wasn't exactly a challenge anyone in his circle would take seriously. Helping a homeless person, spending time with them, understanding them, it was almost laughable. "Sure, why not?" Nate said with a smirk, the words barely out of his mouth before the challenge was set in stone. The next day, Nate found himself walking through Tenderloin, one of the most notoriously rough neighborhoods in San Francisco. He had heard all the stories: crime, addiction, despair. It wasn't the kind of place he would normally visit, but here he was in a pristine suit, trying to blend in. His eyes scanned the street, past the grimy storefronts and the people huddled in corners. He needed someone who was vulnerable but not too dangerous, someone who would accept his offer to help. And then he saw her. She was sitting on the curb, legs crossed, an old sweater draped over her shoulders. Her face was hidden beneath a messy tangle of brown hair, and her clothes were ragged, worn from years of neglect. But even in her state, she carried herself with an odd grace, an aura that was both defiant and resigned. Nate approached cautiously, pulling out his wallet. "Hey," he began, his voice smooth, practiced. "I've got some food here. Maybe I can help you out." The woman looked up slowly, her eyes narrowing as they met his. There was a long pause, one that felt much longer than it actually was. She studied him with a piercing gaze, sizing him up. "Help me?" she asked, her voice rough but sharp. "What are you going to do? Give me a few dollars and pretend you care?" Nate faltered. The usual tactics, handing over cash, a smile, a quick fix, were useless here. This wasn't someone who would fall for a shallow gesture. Nate hesitated, trying to gather his thoughts. "I'm just trying to make things better. I know it's not much, but maybe we could talk. Get to know each other." The woman's lips curled into a half smile, not one of amusement, but one of cynicism. She stood up slowly, brushing dust off her jeans. "Yeah," she said, almost mocking. "You want to help me? Fine. But first, you'll have to understand something. No one like you can help someone like me." Nate blinked, taken aback. He had expected rejection, but not this kind of challenge. He started to speak, but the woman cut him off. "I don't need your pity," she said sharply. "You want to help me? Then maybe you should try walking a mile in my shoes." Nate stood there stunned as she walked away, disappearing into the crowd. For the first time in his life, he felt something he wasn't used to: embarrassment. It wasn't supposed to be this hard. He was used to getting what he wanted, always. But this wasn't a transaction. This wasn't about money or status. This was something else entirely. The next morning, Nate found himself walking the same grimy streets of Tenderloin, his mind racing. He had spent the entire night replaying the conversation with Ella over and over in his head. Her words echoed in his ears. "No one like you can help someone like me." It stung more than he cared to admit. Nate had spent his life conquering challenges, using his wealth and influence to get what he wanted, but this was different. Ella wasn't impressed by his money. She wasn't going to fall for the usual tricks. This wasn't some transaction where he could hand out cash and feel good about himself. He needed a new approach. He walked down the same sidewalk where he had first spotted her, scanning the area for her. There were plenty of people here, men and women in ragged clothes sitting on the sidewalk, some talking to themselves, others just staring into space. But there was no sign of her. Nate's eyes darted around as he walked, trying to appear casual, though every part of him was tense. He wasn't sure what to expect when he found her again, but he couldn't back down now. Finally, near the corner, he saw her. Elle was sitting on the same stoop, her head down, the worn-out sweater wrapped tightly around her. She looked tired, more so than before, and he felt an instinctive pull to walk toward her. But this time, he wasn't going to offer her food or money. He wasn't going to pretend he could fix her life. He approached slowly, trying to keep his presence as non-intrusive as possible. Ella didn't look up at first, lost in whatever thoughts she was consumed by. "Hey," Nate said softly, trying to keep his voice calm, casual. "Mind if I sit down?" Elle looked up slowly, her eyes narrowing as she took him in. For a moment, she just studied him, her gaze as sharp as ever. Then, without a word, she shifted slightly to the side, offering him just enough space to sit next to her. Nate hesitated, but then sat down beside her. The silence between them hung thick in the air, and for the first time, Nate felt the weight of the moment. "You still think I'm just another rich guy trying to play hero?" Nate asked, his voice low but sincere. He wasn't sure if he was asking her or himself. Elle didn't answer immediately. She just stared at him, her expression unreadable. Her face was still hardened, but there was a vulnerability there that Nate hadn't noticed before. "I don't need saving," she finally said, her voice steady but with an edge. "You can't fix me. You don't even know me." Nate swallowed, his mind racing. He wasn't prepared for this level of resistance. He'd always been good at getting what he wanted. But Ella? She was different. She wasn't impressed by his wealth, his charm, or his influence. "I'm not trying to fix you," he said, his voice softer now, more genuine. "I'm just trying to understand." Elle's eyes flicked over to him, scrutinizing him again. There was a long pause before she spoke, her voice almost a whisper. "You don't get it, do you?" she asked. "You think you can come down here, drop a few dollars, and everything will magically change. But it doesn't work like that. People like me, we don't need pity. We need real change. We need people who will stick around after the cameras are gone, after the donations dry up." Nate felt a lump in his throat. She was right in a way he didn't fully understand. He had lived a life of constant achievement, always pushing forward, always chasing the next big thing. But for the first time, he realized how little he truly understood about the lives of people like Elle. He thought he could help her, but now he wasn't so sure. "I'm not going anywhere," Nate said, the words coming out before he could fully process them. Elle's gaze softened for the first time, though her expression was still guarded. She said nothing for a long time, and Nate began to think she was done with him. But then slowly she spoke. "Why?" she asked, her voice quieter now, almost a murmur. Nate looked at her, his heart pounding in his chest. "Because I want to understand," he said. "Because maybe I'm tired of pretending I can fix everything with money. Maybe I want to know what it's like to help someone for real." Ella met his gaze, the intensity of her eyes pulling him in. For a moment, he thought she might say something else, but instead she just nodded, as if accepting his words without fully believing them. "All right," she said, standing up slowly. "But don't think it's going to be easy." As Elle walked away, leaving him standing there on the stoop, Nate felt a strange sense of both defeat and determination. This was just the beginning. He had a long way to go. Nate returned to Tenderloin the next day, determined to find Elle again. The encounter from yesterday still played over in his mind like a broken record. He had expected to offer her some food and maybe make a small difference in her life. What he hadn't expected was the wall of resistance she'd thrown up. Her words had cut deep. "You can't fix me," she'd said. And in those words, Nate realized something he hadn't before. He didn't understand. As he walked through the chaotic streets, he found himself looking past the superficiality of the area, The graffiti-covered walls, the dilapidated buildings, the homeless lying in the streets. For the first time, he saw it for what it really was, a community filled with stories that had been overlooked for too long. When he spotted Elle again, sitting against the same grimy wall, she looked smaller somehow. Her face was hidden by a tangle of hair, and she had her arms wrapped around her knees. The sight made something shift inside Nate, but he wasn't sure what. Elle, he called softly, approaching cautiously. She didn't look up immediately. He hesitated, unsure how to begin. The usual lines, "How are you doing?" felt empty, patronizing. He couldn't offer her that anymore. She finally raised her head, her eyes locking with his. She didn't say anything at first, just studied him, as if trying to figure out what he wanted. "I didn't come here to fix you," Nate said, his voice steadier than he felt. "I just want to understand, if you'll let me." There was a long silence between them, and for a moment he wondered if she'd walk away again. But instead she sighed deeply, as if weighed down by something she'd been carrying for far too long. "Understand what?" she asked, her voice rough from the cold wind. "You've got everything. Money, connections, people who do whatever you want. What could you possibly understand about me?" Nate lowered himself to sit next to her, keeping a respectful distance. "You'd be surprised," he said quietly. "I don't know what it's like, but I know it's not the way I've been living. It's not just about being rich or having a big job. It's about, well, I don't know what it's about yet, but I want to learn." Elle looked at him again, her gaze still guarded but now tinged with curiosity. "You're serious," she muttered. "I thought you were just like the others, the ones who come and go, give a little change, and forget about me the next minute." Nate nodded, swallowing hard. He could feel the weight of her words. "I am different, at least I want to be." Ella shifted slightly, her eyes flicking down at her hands, which were clasped tightly together in her lap. Nate noticed how fragile she looked, despite her tough exterior. There was something in her posture, something vulnerable yet fiercely protective, that struck him. "You've got a lot of questions, don't you?" she asked, her voice softer now. She wasn't mocking him, not entirely. There was something almost weary in her tone. "I guess I have a story, if you really want to hear it." Nate sat up straighter, focusing intently on her. I do want to hear it." Elle took a deep breath, looking out into the street before she started. Her voice was quiet but steady, as if she had told this story 1,000 times, yet each time it hurt just as much. "I used to have everything," she said, staring down at her hands. "I had a career, friends, a life. I was respected, successful. I had my own studio. People looked up to me." She paused, as if the words felt foreign coming out of her mouth. "But then I lost it all. I don't talk about it much because people don't understand. They just assume I messed up." Nate stayed silent, his heart pounding. This was the side of Elle he had been craving to see, the real Elle. Not the hardened, angry version from the streets, but the woman who had once had a future. "Go on," he said, his voice gentle. Elle sighed and rubbed her forehead as if trying to push away the memory. "I trusted the wrong people. My best friend Lena, she betrayed me. She got involved with my ex-husband. He drained my savings, destroyed my business, and then left me with nothing. No job, no home, just debts and lies." Nate felt the weight of her words sink in. He couldn't imagine what that kind of betrayal would feel like, but the anguish in her voice was undeniable. "And here I am," Ella continued, her voice cracking slightly. "Living on the streets alone with no one to help, no one who cares." There was a long pause. Nate didn't know how to respond to her pain, to the depth of her loss. It was more than just about survival. It was about trust, about being broken and having to rebuild everything from nothing. He wanted to say something to comfort her, but words didn't feel like enough. So instead he sat there, just listening, just being there. "You still have people who care," Nate finally said, his voice firm. "Maybe not the ones who should have, but I care. I'm here." Elle didn't say anything at first. She just looked at him with those guarded eyes, unsure whether to believe him or not. But for the first time, Nate thought she might just let him in. Nate couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed. It wasn't just the air around him in his sleek office in Silicon Valley or the piles of paperwork on his desk. It was deeper, something he felt in his gut. Every time his thoughts drifted to Elle, the familiar world he had built for himself, the fast-paced tech empire, the endless streams of money, seemed less important, almost irrelevant. As he sat across from Michael, Elle's ex-husband, a familiar unease crept up. Michael had always been the kind of person who could turn on charm at the drop of a hat, but today his smile felt more like a mask. "Glad you could make it, Nate," Michael said, leaning forward. "I've got an offer for you." Nate nodded, trying to ignore the uneasiness tightening in his chest. "Let's hear it." Michael slid a folder across the desk, the glossy paper almost mocking Nate's discomfort. "I've got a new project lined up. I know the kind of wealth and influence you can bring to the table. It's a game changer, Nate. Something that could triple your assets within the year." Nate raised an eyebrow. The kind of opportunity Michael was describing was exactly the kind of deal he thrived on. High risk, high reward. But as much as the idea of expanding his empire excited him, something in the back of his mind told him it wasn't just about business. "And what's the catch?" Nate asked, his tone even but cautious. Michael smiled, the glint in his eyes making Nate feel like he was about to walk into a trap. "Simple. I need you to cut ties with Elle." Nate froze for a moment, his mind racing. "What do you mean?" "She's a liability, Nate," Michael said bluntly. "You've been spending time with her and it's starting to look bad. People are starting to talk. She's damaged goods and we both know it. Her past is one disaster after another. You can't afford to be associated with someone like her if you want to keep your position at the top." The words hit Nate like a punch to the gut. He opened his mouth to respond, but nothing came out. Michael was right about one thing. Elle's past was filled with chaos and betrayal. But what Michael didn't understand was that she wasn't just damaged goods. She was real. She was a person, not some project to fix or cast aside when it was no longer convenient. "Think about it," Michael continued, pushing the folder closer to Nate. "You can make all this money, double or triple your portfolio. I'll make sure you're set. All you have to do is let her go. It's a small price to pay." Nate stared at the folder, his fingers itching to push it away. It wasn't the money that bothered him. It was the price of his soul that felt like it was being sold right before his eyes. He looked up at Michael, meeting his gaze. "And if I don't?" Michael leaned back in his chair, his smile turning colder. "Then you're on your own. But remember, Nate, you're not just making business decisions anymore. You're making life choices." Nate couldn't sleep that night. The weight of the decision Michael had laid before him gnawed at him. He had been warned about mixing business with personal life, but this was different. This wasn't just about wealth. It was about who he was becoming. He didn't recognize himself anymore. Elle had given him something he hadn't realized he was missing: meaning. The way she opened up to him, the raw pain behind her eyes, and the trust she began to place in him. It had made him realize how shallow his existence had been. But now Michael's words echoed in his mind. Cut ties with Elle. Could he really do it? Could he throw away the only real connection he'd ever had, just for the sake of his empire? The next day, Nate walked into Elle's shelter with a heavy heart. He had to see her, had to tell her something, even though he didn't know what it was yet. The moment he walked in, his eyes scanned the room, but he didn't see her immediately. She was nowhere to be found. He asked around, his voice tight with urgency. "She was here earlier," a woman said, pointing toward the back of the shelter. Nate made his way to the back, his thoughts racing. And then he saw her, sitting in the farthest corner, staring out the window, her arms wrapped tightly around herself. She didn't look up when he approached. For a moment, Nate just stood there, unsure of what to say. The weight of the decision he had to make hung over him like a cloud. He opened his mouth, but the words stuck in his throat. "Elle," he started, his voice breaking the silence. She turned her head slowly, her expression unreadable. "I've been offered a deal," he continued, unable to meet her eyes. "A chance to make everything I've worked for even bigger." Ella raised an eyebrow, her gaze sharp. And I'm being asked to make a choice," Nate said, his voice low. "To cut ties with you." Elle looked at him, but she didn't say anything at first. Her expression softened slightly, but there was no anger in her eyes, only a quiet resignation. "You don't have to choose, Nate," she said, her voice steady as if she'd already known the answer all along. "But you will, and I get it. I know what matters to you. It always has." Nate's heart dropped. She knew, and somehow that made everything worse. Nate's footsteps echoed through the sterile, dimly lit hallway of the homeless shelter. The smell of antiseptic and something else, something deeper, hung in the air. It was the scent of struggle, of forgotten lives, of people pushed to the edges of society. He had been here once before, but today it felt different. Today, it felt heavier. He had promised himself he wouldn't just walk away, not after everything he had learned. But standing here now, in this space that felt as though it swallowed the hope out of you the moment you entered, he was starting to doubt himself. Nate had always been able to fix problems, business problems, financial problems, even personal problems to an extent. But this was something else entirely. This wasn't something that could be solved with money, influence, or even good intentions. This was real. This was Elle's world. "Elle," Nate called out softly, his voice cracking slightly as he stepped further into the shelter. He had heard from one of the volunteers she had been in and out of here all day. The air was thick with quiet conversations and muffled sobs, but he couldn't see her. Nate walked past a few more beds, his heart racing. She hadn't responded to his texts. He hadn't been able to reach her all morning. He knew something was off. Finally, at the far end of the room, near the corner where the light was dimmest, he saw her. Ella was sitting on the floor, her back against the wall, her knees drawn up to her chest. She didn't look up at him when he approached, but he could see her shaking slightly. Her posture was stiff, almost like she was trying to keep something inside. Nate hesitated, unsure of how to approach her this time. What could he say? He had been so consumed with his own problems, his deal with Michael, his family's expectations, that he had failed to notice just how much Elle was struggling. He was so wrapped up in his own mess that he hadn't noticed her silence, her retreat into herself. "Elle," Nate said again, more firmly this time. "What happened?" Elle flinched slightly but didn't look up. She drew her knees tighter to her chest, trying to hide herself from view. "I'm fine," she whispered, but the tremble in her voice betrayed her. "No, you're not," Nate said, kneeling down beside her. "You're not fine. Talk to me." Elle's lip trembled, and for a moment Nate thought she might push him away again. But instead she spoke, her voice low and almost broken. "I'm just tired, Nate. Tired of pretending it's okay." She inhaled sharply. "I don't want your pity, but sometimes I don't know how much longer I can do this." She lifted her head, her eyes filled with unshed tears. "You don't get it, Nate. No one does. You think you can come in here and fix everything with money, with nice words, but it's not that simple. It's not that easy." Nate's heart clenched in his chest as he watched her. She wasn't looking at him. She was looking straight ahead, but her words stung. It wasn't just the pain she was hiding. It was the exhaustion, the defeat in her voice that hit him hardest. "I don't know how to fix this, Elle," Nate said softly, his voice barely above a whisper. "But I'm here. I'm not going anywhere." She let out a bitter laugh, though there was no humor in it. "That's what they all say. They all say they're here, that they care. But when the going gets tough, when I need someone to stay, they all leave." Her voice broke for a moment, and Nate felt a pang in his chest, something that tightened and twisted in his gut. "You'll leave too, just like everyone else." Nate felt the sting of her words, the weight of her history pressing down on him. He wanted to say something to make it all better, but he knew better. The words wouldn't change anything. They never did. Instead, he sat down beside her, saying nothing for a long while. He just stayed there, his presence a quiet promise. Elle didn't push him away this time, though she didn't speak either. They sat in silence, two broken people, each lost in their own thoughts. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, Elle spoke again, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know if I can trust you," she said, her eyes still fixed on the floor. "But I'm trying." Nate's heart lifted slightly at the sound of her words, but he knew there was still a long way to go. The road ahead wasn't going to be easy for either of them. But for the first time in a long time, Nate felt like he was starting to understand. He wasn't here to fix her. He wasn't here to solve all her problems, but he was here for her. And that maybe was enough. Nate arrived at his mother's estate, a sprawling mansion tucked away in Pacific Heights, feeling a knot tighten in his chest. He had been avoiding these walls for weeks, ever since his conversations with Elle had grown more serious. He had always known that his family wouldn't understand, but he hadn't fully grasped the extent of their disapproval. Vivian Carver, his mother, was a force to be reckoned with. Elegant, poised, and terrifyingly judgmental. Her standards were higher than any mountain, and she had always expected Nate to rise to the top without hesitation. But as much as Nate had tried to meet those expectations, he felt a deepening conflict inside him. Elle had become a part of his life, and no amount of wealth or prestige seemed to matter anymore. He walked into the grand foyer, its marble floors gleaming under the chandelier's light. As soon as the door clicked shut behind him, his mother's voice rang through the house. "Nate, there you are. I thought you'd forgotten your mother's birthday," Vivian said, her voice laced with the usual mix of irritation and authority. Nate forced a smile, pushing back the unease that was building up. "I didn't forget, Mom. I've just had a lot on my plate lately." Vivian appeared in the doorway, dressed in a form-fitting black gown. She studied Nate with a practiced, calculating gaze. "I can see that. I just didn't expect you to be late for such an important occasion. You should know better." "Sorry," Nate muttered, trying to shake off the tension. He had bigger things on his mind. His mother waved him off dismissively. "Well, you're here now. I'm sure your guests are all waiting for you in the garden. You can catch up with them after the cake." She turned, leading him toward the back of the house. But before they made it to the garden, Nate felt a cold chill in the air. Vivian suddenly stopped and turned to face him. Her eyes narrowed, and her lips tightened into a thin line. "So tell me," she began, her voice lowering, "how is that little homeless woman you've been spending all your time with? I heard you've been showing her around, making her feel special." Vivian's tone dripped with sarcasm. "How lovely." Nate stiffened. The words cut deeper than he had expected. "Elle's not just some homeless woman," he said, his voice thick with frustration. I don't need to hear your excuses, Nate," Vivian interrupted. "You're my only son, and I raised you to have standards. You know what kind of image you're projecting with this ridiculous charity project of yours. She's not someone you bring into this world." Nate felt his anger rising, but he bit it back. "You don't understand, Mom. Ella isn't just some project, she's—" "Stop!" Vivian snapped, holding up a hand. "I don't need to hear any more. You're making a fool of yourself. You think you're some sort of savior, don't you? You're letting your emotions cloud your judgment. This is not the kind of woman you marry, not the kind of woman you associate with, Nate. I don't care how much you care for her, she's not our kind." The finality in her words stung. Nate opened his mouth to respond, but something in the expression on his mother's face made him hesitate. Vivian had always been unyielding, but this was something different. This wasn't about concern for him, it was about control. She wanted him to remain the person she had always seen him as. The successful heir, the person who didn't have time for anything messy or inconvenient. "You can't be serious," Nate said, his voice shaking with a mixture of disbelief and hurt. "Elle is real. She's been through things you couldn't even begin to understand, but I'm not just going to walk away from her because you don't approve." Vivian's face hardened. "If you want to throw away everything we've worked for, everything you've worked for, that's your choice. But don't expect me to support it. Don't expect anyone in this family to." She turned, her voice ice cold. "You've made your choice. I just hope it doesn't cost you everything." With that, she left him standing in the foyer, the weight of her words hanging in the air like an oppressive fog. Nate stood frozen, the anger still simmering beneath the surface. The woman who had always shaped his life, his path, his purpose, his expectations, was now the one telling him to turn his back on someone he cared about, someone who had become more real to him than anything his mother or his business could ever offer. But as the sounds of laughter and music filtered in from the garden, Nate felt the sharp pang of realization. He didn't belong here anymore, not in the way Vivian wanted him to, and the thought of letting Elle slip away, of choosing between her and the life his mother expected, was no longer an option. Nate had been coming to the shelter every day now, though each time it felt like a new challenge. The walls here were thick with silence, heavy with the stories people carried with them, stories that, like Elle's, were untold. Every time he walked through those doors, he could feel the gravity of her past pressing on him. Today, he had noticed something different about her. She wasn't sitting in her usual spot near the back, but instead, she had been pacing in a small corner, lost in thought. Her face was tired, but more than that, it was distant, like she was somewhere else, somewhere far beyond the shelter's worn walls. He approached her carefully, not wanting to startle her. "Elle," Nate called gently, his voice soft in the stillness. "What's going on?" She looked up, her eyes meeting his briefly before looking away. There was a hesitation in her gaze, something unspoken that made Nate's stomach tighten. "I'm fine," Elle said quickly, brushing her hair behind her ear. But her words were far from convincing. Nate knew better than to believe the lie. "Elle, I can tell something's wrong," he said, stepping closer, his voice insistent. "Talk to me. You've been different the past few days." Her eyes flicked to the floor, a deep sigh escaping her lips. For a moment she was silent, her gaze heavy with the weight of something buried deep inside. Finally she looked up at him, her expression softening, but there was no denying the pain behind her eyes. "I can't do this anymore, Nate," she whispered. "I can't keep pretending that everything's okay." Nate's heart sank. He stepped closer, reaching out slowly as if to bridge the distance between them. "What do you mean?" Ella hesitated, chewing on her bottom lip. She stared down at the floor again before slowly exhaling. "You deserve better. You don't belong in this mess." Her voice was barely audible, laced with an ache he hadn't heard before. Nate frowned, confused. "I'm not going anywhere. You don't get to decide that for me. I'm here because I want to be here." But Elle shook her head, a bitter smile curling on her lips. "No, you don't understand. I've been carrying this secret for so long, and now it's too much." Nate's pulse quickened as he searched her face for any sign of what she was about to say. The last few weeks, he had seen glimpses of Elle's strength, her walls, her pride, her scars. But this felt different. "What secret?" Nate asked, his voice barely above a whisper, the weight of the question settling heavily between them. Elle swallowed hard, her eyes closing for a moment as if steeling herself. "I didn't tell you everything. I didn't want you to know." Nate stepped forward, his heart racing as he reached for her arm, gently touching her. "You don't have to keep things from me, Elle. You can trust me." For a long moment, she just stood there, her lips trembling, her eyes staring past him as though seeing something only she could see. Then, in a barely audible voice, she said, "I was married. I had everything, the career, the home, the respect. But my best friend, she betrayed me. She took everything from me." Nate's breath caught in his throat. He had heard hints of her past, but he hadn't realized how deep the wound ran. She had never told him the full story, not until now. "Lena," she continued, her voice breaking, "she was the one who convinced my ex-husband to ruin me. She was the one who exposed everything, made sure I lost it all, my reputation, my business, everything. And it's been haunting me ever since." Nate stood frozen, his hand still on her arm, his mind reeling from the weight of her words. The betrayal she spoke of was the kind that shattered everything a person believed in. Elle's eyes welled up with tears, but she quickly wiped them away, her pride still refusing to break. "I didn't want anyone to know, especially you. I didn't want you to see me as broken." The pain in her voice hit him harder than anything he had felt before. It wasn't just the loss of her career, it was the loss of trust, the loss of faith in the people closest to her. Nate stepped closer, his voice low but steady. "I don't see you as broken. I see you as someone who's been hurt by people who didn't deserve you. And I'm not going anywhere, Elle. I'm not." She looked at him, her eyes searching his face as if looking for any sign of insincerity. But when she found none, she let out a slow breath. I don't know if I can trust anyone again, Nate. I've been hurt so many times. I've lost so much. Her voice cracked, and this time, she didn't try to hide the tears that fell freely. Nate moved closer, wrapping his arms around her, holding her tightly, and for the first time he felt her walls begin to crumble. "I'm here," he whispered, his heart pounding in his chest. "I'll be here no matter what." The ringing of the phone was sharp, jarring in the quiet of Nate's apartment. He glanced at the screen, a single word flashing across it: L. His heart skipped, but the moment of excitement quickly turned to worry. It was late, too late for a casual check-in. He picked up the phone immediately. "L?" he answered, his voice tight. There was a long pause before she spoke, her voice weak, almost unrecognizable. "Nate, I need you." Panic surged through him. "What's wrong? Where are you?" "I'm at the shelter. I'm not feeling well." The words were strained, as though speaking took too much effort. "Can you come? I'll be right there," he said, hanging up without another word. By the time Nate arrived, the shelter was dimly lit, the usual hum of activity replaced by an eerie stillness. He rushed through the entrance, his eyes scanning the room, searching for Elle. When he found her, she was sitting in a corner, curled up on a cot, her face pale, her eyes half closed. She looked smaller, frailer than he had ever seen her. "Elle," Nate breathed, kneeling beside her. He reached out, gently touching her arm, and she flinched slightly but didn't pull away. "I'm sorry," she whispered, her voice hoarse. "I didn't want to bother you, No," Nate interrupted, his voice shaking with concern. "Don't say that. What's going on? You don't look good." She hesitated, her eyes flickering with uncertainty. "I haven't been feeling well for a few days. It's just, I didn't think it was serious." Nate's eyes narrowed. He could tell she was hiding something, but the worry in her voice was undeniable. He stood up quickly, his heart racing. "You need to get checked out. I'm taking you to the hospital." Elle's face twisted into a brief, painful expression. I can't afford it. She stopped herself, but Nate could see the discomfort in her eyes. "I'm not asking," he said firmly, taking her hand. "We're going now. If you don't want to go for you, go for me." She looked at him, the vulnerability in her eyes cutting through him. For a moment, she said nothing. Then, in a quiet voice, she finally nodded. "Okay, I'll go." The ride to the hospital was tense. Elle's breath was shallow, her hands trembling slightly in her lap. Nate kept stealing glances at her, each time seeing more of the exhaustion and fear in her face. When they arrived, he didn't wait for her to argue. He led her straight through the doors, bypassing the check-in desk. He could see the nurses giving him curious looks as he hurried her into an examination room. The doctor, a middle-aged woman with a no-nonsense attitude, entered shortly after, checking Ella's vitals with a professional efficiency. "How long have you been feeling this way?" she asked. I don't know," Ella stammered. "A few days. I thought it was just exhaustion." The doctor raised an eyebrow. "Have you had any chronic conditions we should know about?" Ella hesitated before replying, her gaze drifting to the floor. "I've had some health problems in the past, but nothing serious." The doctor gave a small nod, noting something on her chart. "We'll run some tests," she said, turning to Nate. "It's best if you wait outside while we get started." Nate sat in the waiting room, his hands clasped tightly in his lap, the weight of the situation settling in. He couldn't help but think of how many times Elle had hidden her pain, how often she had dismissed her own needs for the sake of survival. He knew her past was filled with betrayal and loss, but this was different. She wasn't just hiding her emotions now, she was hiding something much more dangerous. The minutes stretched into what felt like hours. Nate's nerves were on edge, his thoughts spinning wildly as he waited for the doctor to return. When the door finally opened, the doctor's expression was grim. "Mr. Carver," she began, her tone serious, "we've run some tests, and it looks like there's an underlying health condition here. It's more severe than just exhaustion. Elle has a chronic illness that's been exacerbated by her living conditions. I'm afraid she's not just sick. She's in serious danger if we don't start treatment immediately." Nate's heart plummeted. The words hit him like a punch, but they weren't enough to stop him from asking the question that had been building in his chest. "What kind of illness?" he asked, barely able to speak. "She has chronic respiratory issues, likely worsened by stress and poor living conditions. But it's more than that. There are complications. If she doesn't get proper care soon, it could become life-threatening." Nate's mind raced as the gravity of her situation sank in. Ella wasn't just fighting to survive on the streets. She was fighting for her life, and he hadn't even known. He returned to her side, his face full of determination. "We're going to get through this," he said, his voice steady but full of resolve. Elle looked at him, her face pale, her eyes filled with confusion and fear. "But I can't. I don't want to burden you anymore. I don't want you to see me like this." Nate took her hand, squeezing it gently. "You're not a burden, Elle. Not now, not ever." The weight of the last few days hung heavily on Nate. The hospital, Elle's diagnosis, and the future that seemed to be slipping through his fingers all pressed in on him like a vice. He knew he needed to act fast, but what was the right thing to do? Elle's health had worsened after the diagnosis, her condition more severe than anyone had anticipated. She was no longer able to stay at the shelter, the place that had offered her so little safety to begin with. Nate couldn't bear the thought of her in such a vulnerable state, so he had offered her a place in his apartment, even if she hadn't fully accepted it yet. But his family, the people who had been his entire world for so long, hadn't been so understanding. The moment they learned he was spending more time with Ella, the disapproval had been swift and unforgiving. His mother had voiced her concerns loud and clear. "This is not who you are, Nate. She's a distraction. She's not right for you." Despite the tension, despite the pull of his old life, Nate knew one thing above all. He couldn't leave her. He couldn't turn his back on someone who had shown him the kind of truth he had never experienced before. She had given him something he didn't know he was missing, real connection, and he wasn't about to walk away from that. It was late, nearly midnight, when Nate walked through the door of his apartment after a meeting with his investors. The weight of the business deals and pressures had grown more intense. The idea of stepping away from everything for someone he could never introduce to his family, the idea of fighting for love, felt like a burden. But he couldn't ignore it anymore. Ella was sitting on the couch, her back slightly arched in pain as she tried to breathe easily, her chest rising and falling in shallow motions. Her health was fragile, but it was more than that. The emotional toll was just as heavy. She had been trying to pull away from him, pushing him out of her world so he wouldn't have to deal with her illness. But Nate wasn't going anywhere. "Elle," he said softly, dropping his briefcase by the door. His voice was firm but tender, as though he was trying to reach her without breaking the fragile silence between them. She looked up at him, her eyes tired but still full of the defiance he had come to recognize. "You're home late," she said, her voice weak but laced with that same resistance. "I'm not leaving," Nate replied, standing still, watching her closely. His words hung in the air between them, like a declaration that carried all of the uncertainty and the courage he had mustered. Elle's gaze softened, but there was still something in her eyes, something that pushed him away. "You don't have to stay here, Nate. This is too much. No," he interrupted, stepping closer. "I'm not leaving you." His voice cracked slightly as he took a step forward, his hand reaching out toward hers. She didn't pull away, but her lips tightened into a line, as if she was trying to hold back the emotions she was fighting so hard to suppress. "You deserve better than this," Ella whispered, her voice shaky as she tried to speak past the lump in her throat. I'm not the person you think I am. You don't want this life. You shouldn't have to deal with all this mess." Nate's heart ached at her words. "What mess, Elle?" he asked softly, crouching in front of her. "You think I care about that? I care about you. You're what matters. Not your past, not the mistakes people made. Just you." Ella's eyes glistened, the tears threatening to fall as she looked down at their intertwined hands. Her fingers curled around his, but there was still hesitation in her touch. "You don't get it," she whispered. "I've been through so much. People left. People always leave." "I'm not leaving," Nate said firmly, lifting her chin gently so she would look at him. "I'm here, Ella. I'm staying. I know it's not easy and I know you're scared, but I'm not going anywhere." She pulled away slightly, her gaze hardening again. "And what about your family? What about your life? They don't accept me, Nate. They never will. I'm just not good enough for someone like you." The words hit him harder than he expected, and for a moment his resolve wavered. He had been living in the shadow of his family's expectations for so long that he'd begun to believe they were right. But looking at Ella now, looking at her strength, her vulnerability, everything she had been through, he knew he was done living for someone else's vision of his life. "I don't care about that," Nate said with a newfound determination. "This is my life, and I choose you. I'm not choosing their world anymore." Ella's face softened, but she looked away, the vulnerability too much for her to face. "You don't have to do this for me, Nate. You deserve someone who doesn't have all this baggage, someone who can give you what you need." Nate reached for her hand again, his voice quiet but filled with conviction. "You are what I need." For a long moment, there was only the sound of the breathing, the silence between them both heavy with the weight of everything unsaid. Then, slowly, Ella turned to face him, her eyes searching his face as though trying to determine if he meant it. Finally, she nodded, her shoulders sagging with a quiet surrender. "I don't know how this will work," she whispered, "but I'll try. For you." Nate smiled softly, his chest tight with emotion. "That's all I need. Just try." And with that, the walls that had been between them began to break down piece by piece, and Nate realized that the battle for their love, for something real, wasn't just his to fight. It was theirs. Nate sat in the quiet of his apartment, the city lights casting long shadows across the room. The weight of the decision he had to make hung heavily in the air. His phone sat on the table in front of him, a message from his mother still blinking on the screen. He had ignored it for the past few hours, not wanting to face the ultimatum she had laid before him. "Choose," the message read. "You can't have both. You know that." His mind kept replaying the moments leading up to this. The constant pressure from his family to stay within their circle, the relentless demands of his business, and the undeniable pull toward Ella, toward the raw truth of what she had shown him. But now, his world was on the line. The choices he had made over the past few months had led him to this point, where nothing could stay the same. His life had been a series of clear paths, defined by the people he surrounded himself with and the work he did. But Elle had thrown that all into chaos. And now, as her health continued to deteriorate, as his family pressed harder for him to abandon her, Nate felt the walls closing in. Elle had been in and out of the hospital for the past few days, and though the treatments were helping, she wasn't getting any better. She had tried to keep her struggles hidden from him, as though to protect him from the reality of what was happening. But Nate could see it now. She was slipping away, and the only thing he could offer her was his support. But was it enough? He hadn't seen Elle all day. She had asked for space, something she had never done before. The hospital visits, the stress of her condition, and his increasingly strained relationship with his family had taken its toll on her. She had pulled away, and Nate had no idea if this was the distance of someone trying to protect themselves, or the distance of someone who had already decided to give up. A knock at the door startled him from his thoughts. He stood up quickly, his heart racing as he approached the door. When he opened it, Ella was standing in the hallway, her face pale and drawn, her eyes looking tired but determined. "Elle," Nate whispered, stepping aside to let her in. "Where have you been?" She walked past him, her steps slow and deliberate. "I needed to be alone," she said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. "I needed to think." Nate closed the door behind them, his pulse quickening. He could feel the tension between them, an unspoken distance that neither of them had acknowledged until now. "What did you think about?" he asked, keeping his voice calm, even though his insides were screaming. He needed to know where they stood, where she stood, in this overwhelming mess they had found themselves in. Elle turned to face him, her eyes searching his face as though weighing her next words carefully. "I thought about us," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "I thought about how much I'm asking you to give up for me, for someone like me." Nate's chest tightened. He could feel the weight of her words, the heaviness of her doubt. "You're not asking for anything, Elle," he said, taking a step toward her. "You don't have to ask. I want to be here." She shook her head, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "You don't understand. I don't belong in your world. I've tried, Nate. I've tried to be what you want, what everyone expects. But I'm not. I can't be, and I won't drag you down with me." The words hit him like a punch. She was pushing him away. "Elle," Nate said softly, his voice thick with emotion, "you're not a burden. You're not some mistake that I need to fix. You're my choice. You have to see that." But Ella was shaking her head again, her breath shallow. "I can't let you choose me," she whispered. "Not when you're giving up everything else. Your family, your future." Nate felt his heart break at her words. He hadn't realized how deep her insecurity ran, how terrified she was of losing him. But he wasn't going anywhere. "I'm not giving up anything," Nate said fiercely. "I'm choosing you, not my family, not my business. You. This is my choice, Elle. I want you. I want this." Ella looked at him for a long moment, the silence stretching between them as if she were searching for some hint of insincerity. When she found none, her eyes softened, the weight of her fears easing, if only for a moment. But then the phone rang, breaking the fragile silence. Nate glanced at it, seeing the name of his mother flash across the screen. The choice that had been hanging over him, suffocating him, was about to be made for him. He felt a pang of guilt, but his resolve didn't waver. "I can't do this anymore," he whispered to himself. He turned to Ella, taking her hand in his. "Whatever happens with them," he said, looking her in the eyes, "I'm not leaving you. I'll fight for us, for you." And in that moment, as the phone continued to ring, Nate made his decision. He wasn't going back, not to his family, not to the life he had built without her. He turned off the phone, cutting off the last link to the life he was leaving behind. This was it, the final choice. And he had chosen her.